Okay. We're going to wait for those of us who are just joining us. We're going to wait about another minute, and so people can join in, and then we'll get started with some introductions and go from there. I do see some stragglers coming in, so. All right, well, while people join, I'll try and lay out a little bit of our kind of ground rules for where we're going. We want this to be an intimate interview, just a conversation between two scholars about what they know about their fields and their experiences in it. And so this is part of the SHA Across the Generations interviews that we want to really start off as precursors for the annual conference, and then hopefully we can extend them a little further as we continue. But we'll do some basic questions where I'll ask Joe and Abina to answer, and then we'll save our commentary from the audience to the end for about 10 minutes of Q&A. So if you want to type those out in the chat, if that's available, or we can just save them to the very end. Okay, but if I think this is probably the most of us, so if we want to get started, I am Miller Wright, if you don't know me. I am assistant professor of Native American history at Old Dominion University, and I have the honor of emceeing this event for the membership committee for the Southern Historical Association. And we're really excited today to be able to talk about African American history and Southern history, and really get two experts' opinions on the state of the field today, and hopefully where it's heading, or what we're afraid of where it might head, challenges and things we're excited about. So to start off, Dr. Abina Bokchiwa Ansa is the newly appointed Associate Director of the George Ann Richards Civil War Era at the Penn State University, also Assistant Research Professor there. Abina is a historian of U.S. history with a specialized interest in Black women's worlds, lives, and ideas of freedom in the Civil War era. She's a first-generation Afro-Caribbean and Black British scholar. She began her work at the University of Edinburgh, studying with Civil War historian David Silkenet, who is here. Thank you, David. Abina attended Vanderbilt University, where she completed her doctorate in history as the last student of Professor Richard Blackett in 2022. Her first manuscript, Freedom Was Their North Star, Formerly Enslaved Women's Efforts to Secure and Defend Freedom During the American Civil War, places enslaved women at the forefront of the battle for Black freedom, seeking to recast them as freedom makers rather than passive recipients of freedom. So thank you, Abina, for being here and agreeing to this. Dr. Joseph P. Reedy is an emeritus professor of history at Howard University, where he taught history and served in various administrative positions from 1984 until his retirement in 2017. He's also currently serves as the president of the Southern Historical Association. So thank you, Joe, for that. Prior to joining Howard University, Reedy worked with Ira Berlin, Leslie S. Rowland, and other editors associated with the Freedmen and Southern Society Project at the University of Maryland, College Park. There he helped to produce the first 4 volumes of Freedom, a documentary history of emancipation, published by Cambridge University Press, and several derivative publications, including Free at Last, a documentary history of slavery, freedom, and the Civil War. He's also known for publication of From Slavery to Agrarian Capitalism in the Cotton Plantation South from the University of North Carolina Press in 1992, and Illusions of Emancipation, Pursuit of Freedom and Equality in the Twilight of Slavery, also by University of North Carolina Press, and a Bancroft Prize winner in 2020. Thank you all for joining us. I really appreciate it. Where we want to start off today is really asking y'all, who influenced you and how you became interested in the fields of 19th century African American and Southern history. So if Joe, would you like to start off?
Sure, I don't mind doing that at all. Well, let me begin by thanking you, Wright, for emceeing this conversation this afternoon, and also your colleagues. I know Whitney Stewart is part of the group that helped to assemble the concept and then make it operational. So I'm very grateful to you for that. And I offer those thanks both on my own personal behalf as well as that of the association. So I think this is a good way to start this initiative, which I think will be very productive going forward. All right, so in terms of my early influences, I think, and here I may or may not be overstepping my imagination in terms of what I presume younger colleagues are coming to realize as they enter the field and decide to pursue Southern history and or African American history. And that is to say, I presume that they are influenced by the events in the world around them, because this certainly was the case when I was in college. It was in the midst of the Vietnam War and the Civil Rights Movement. And of course, those two phenomena more or less impinged on our daily lives in one way or another. But intellectually, in terms of the kinds of things we wanted to understand about the world around us, where it had come from, what made it so as it was at the time, and what could we look to the future to hold. The field of history was obviously one way to try to answer those questions. So in fact, I didn't start my undergraduate career in history. I started it in engineering. In fact, I went from engineering to sociology, where I became very much interested in social movements, among other things, but also social movements involving disfranchised folks. So African American freedom movements, labor movements, and things of that nature. And so eventually I made my way to history, again, largely influenced by the events around me, and especially the Civil Rights Movement. Now, I was very fortunate toward the end of my undergraduate career. I was at Villanova University, but due to student unrest at Bryn Mawr College, Bryn Mawr became one of the first universities or colleges to offer a course in African American history. And through a process that involved much student input and much administrative resistance, the college eventually decided to follow the students' recommendation and hire Herbert Aptheker to teach the course. So I was extremely fortunate to be able to audit that class with Herbert Aptheker. In fact, there were several of them. And so from the interest that I had in African American history by virtue of the world around me and my sort of peripheral involvement in some of the activism around that, I got to sit literally at the foot of a master of the material. And I mean, it was just inspiring beyond belief. Certainly enough, I had read the works of Martin Luther King, other major political leaders, including Stokely Carmichael, and others who were active in the movement during the 1960s. So I knew that work, and I knew there was a historical dimension to a lot of it. But in terms of really getting into the professional historians, who also, in many cases, were very much active in the movement themselves, that really began to come to life for me when I sat in on those courses with Herbert Aptheker. So then the whole range of authors and intellectuals who had analyzed not just the contemporary movement then, but the history of the African American experience. John Hope Franklin and everybody else who have written about it in long historical terms, as well as more specialized studies, monographs, if you will. So that whole literature then I became aware of, and I was just frankly fascinated by it. So believe it or not, at Aptheker's recommendation, I decided to look into graduate programs, and especially the one at Northern Illinois University. And even though the persons who specialized in African American history there were not very well-known names, I can call their names right now. John Higginson, for example, who recently retired from UMass Amherst, taught African history, and Christopher Reed, who retired from Roosevelt University a couple of years ago, taught African American history. But once I went to NIU, I studied that field with them, as well as the broader field of U.S. history with Otto Wolfson and Alfred Young and Carl Perini and others, all of whom were very much steeped in historiography, but also the critical historical questions surrounding Southern history and African American history. So that's kind of where it all began for me.
Thank you for sharing that, Joe. No, that sounds like your activism really influenced the future of your scholarship. Abina, do you want to comment on that or give your own perspective on how you became interested in the field and what influenced you?
Yeah, absolutely. Mine is similar and very different all at the same time. In that, as you kind of mentioned in my introduction, I'm a first-gen kid. My dad is from Ghana, my mom is from Trinidad, and I was born in Scotland, raised in England, and now I live in the States. And so questions of identity have always been a part of me, a part of my life, something I've always been interested in. And I was reflecting in preparation for this and remembering when I first encountered W.E.B. Du Bois' work and read Of Our Spiritual Strivings, the first essay in Souls of Black Folks. And I would say that's where everything started for me. I think I realized that with his concept of double consciousness, this idea of African Americans always feeling their two-ness, I realized that the experiences that I was having, that I was working through, were not just unique to me. We're not just teenage quirks. This is actually something that's a thing. This is something that can be studied, can be examined. And it also helped me put language to the difference between a projected identity and one's self-identity. And so I really became interested in that dichotomy, the difference, particularly for the Black diaspora, of what it is to move through issues of white supremacy and race with this kind of two-ness, this projected vision of oneself, and also how one actually sees themselves and understands themselves within their own communities. And so that's where my interest started. It was there with that particular piece of work. I attended the University of Edinburgh, took my first American history course in my first or second year. And then I got to work with David Silkenat, specifically looking at, I think the course was called The Peculiar Institution of Slavery. And so that was my first kind of introduction outside of the familial introductions that I had growing up, kind of looking at the slave castles on the West Coast in Ghana, and learning through kind of familial stories and histories. This is my first time really diving into the history of slavery in the US context. And I essentially just firstly was captivated by US history on the whole. I think when people ask, they're always, surprised that a Brit is diving into this realm of history. And I always say one of the fascinating things for me is you get to see the complete spectrum of human capability in a very short space of time. Growing up in the UK, our history is thousands and thousands of years, but looking at the US specifically, we get to see both the greatest aspects of human striving and capability, and also the worst parts of humanity as well. And that was something that captivated me about US history. And then I went even further with a honors level course in the Civil War specifically. And so also with David Silkenat, and became really, really invested in the Civil War era and interested in that. So what I was really interested in, and I'm still interested in today, is this issue of identity, is this issue of how the enslaved understand themselves. How do we kind of move away from these projected ideas of them, understand the world from their perspective. And so my first my undergraduate thesis, which then became my first article, looked at that using religion during the American Civil War and African-American religious expression. And now I'm looking at it in terms of enslaved women's efforts to create freedom for themselves. So it's evolved over time, but my interest has really come from this issue of identity and really pushed me to see enslaved people and African-American people more generally on their own terms rather than these projected ideas. So in that, of course, I've mentioned his name a couple of times. David Silkenat has been a huge influence in my work. I think being able to work alongside him, but also to read his work. I remember I got to read Driven from Home before it was published, which was really cool. And I got to see what was possible with the sources that were out there. I got to see the type of work that could be done, and that was formative for me. And then, of course, working with Richard Blackett, he's been a huge influence on my work as well, particularly, I would say, besides, of course, his historical prowess, but also his writing style has been really formative for me as well. And then in terms of ideas, Thabile Glimpse is a huge influence in my work, and I feel like I'm building on her work. And Marissa J. Fuentes as well has raised a lot of challenging questions for me too. I'll leave it at that.
No, thank you. That was a great response. I find it heartening as I teach that both of you harken back to teachers and specific teachers, some of whom are here today, who really motivated you to think about your topics and look how successful you all have been. But no, I appreciate that. I'll take that into my own classes as well. Where I want us to think about next is when we're thinking about the fields of 19th century African American history and Southern history. Where do you see the state of the field today? Abina, if you want to start off on this one, and then we'll go to Joe. Yeah.
Sure. I feel like all of my answers for the next few questions are kind of super connected. So if I repeat myself, I apologize. But I think we're kind of at a really exciting moment in 19th century African-American history. I was recently reading the Journal of Civil War, the Civil War era recently did a special issue on 19th century African-American history and the archive. And they made a point that I feel like I've been arguing about for a really long time that I kind of see changing how we do things going forward. Essentially, in the introduction, both which is written by Leslie Harris and Dana Barry, they kind of highlight this lament that has gone across time in terms of the study of African-American history, and this lament over the archive, that these things just can't be studied. There are certain limitations because of the place that these people have occupied in history. And so the thing that I see, even in my own experience as a historian, is kind of this, like, how are you doing the work that you're doing? How is it possible? What are the sources? And I kind of see in this article by them kind of highlighting it, and B, challenging us to, hey, that's not actually true. It's simply that the archive can be, I think they say the archive can be reimagined and reinvented by scholars who ask different questions. And so that's what I see happening right now. I can think of lots of up and coming scholars who are doing the same types of work, just doing it very, very differently. It's not even a case of dramatically different questions necessarily, but I see more innovation in terms of methodology. As I mentioned earlier, I even think Thabile Glimpse's book, The Woman's Fight, that came out a couple of years ago, she repurposes sources that have been used to tell other stories to center enslaved people, to center marginalized voices. And I think it's a really great example of how the sources are there. It's simply asking different questions of the sources. And so it's something that I, as a grad student, as an undergrad, was frustrated by, this constant, like, how do we do this? How is this possible? And what I'm seeing now in the current state, it's not that we've done it, we're not there, but I do see more and more work up and coming. Abby Cooper, for example, is working on some really interesting stuff with Black kind of spiritual expression in contraband camps and such during the Civil War. There's a lot of pending work that's coming out soon that is really changing how we think about African American history in terms of the sources and in terms of the archives. I kind of see us at a turning point that I think we're starting the turn, and I'm going to be optimistic and say that we're keeping on going with that turn.
Oh, thank you for that. I appreciate that optimism. Joe, do you like to follow up?
Well, I would echo that optimism, and I have to confess here that I've followed this discussion about the archive very carefully, in part because so much of my career has depended upon not just the archive in generic terms, but specifically the National Archives of the United States, and specifically those record groups and bodies of records that pertain to the Civil War. And without exaggerating, I've gotten a career's worth of publications and ways of thinking about the Civil War and about 19th century more generally out of that archive, and specifically those record groups of records pertaining to the U.S. Army and the Confederate Army for that matter, but all of the actors involved in the Civil War. And I thought at the beginning of my career that there was enough material there easily to sustain a career. And now at the end of my career, I know that there's more than enough there to sustain another career of mine if I had the time and the energy to do it. But there's just infinite possibilities because the records are so varied, they're so rich, and in some respects, they're so spontaneous in their own way. And I know this doesn't quite sound right to those who would hold to the barriers that archives present. But I and my colleagues with the Freedmen and Southern Society Project always thought of the opportunities that they presented. I mean, here was the first time in the history of the United States where the central government felt the need to document the lives of ordinary citizens in the way that it did during the Civil War. So this is true of soldiers, who David and others have made this very clear. There's just an enormous amount of enormous amount of material about soldiers, now only a fraction of which has been explored up to this point. So if any of you know the work of Jonathan Land, for example, who's looked at court-martial testimony, especially involving African-American soldiers, but white soldiers as well, and he's just finding all kind of material in there, much of which runs against the grain of things that Ira and Leslie and I publish, all of which is good. It's not that we didn't see that material there, it's just that this was 40 years ago. We didn't quite know what to do with it. And so now with the historiography evolving, with people coming up through different life experiences, things jump out of the record at them that they couldn't possibly have been visible to Ira or Leslie or me. But that's a good thing. But again, without sounding like a broken record, I can't help thinking that archives, even when assembled by barrier institutions that didn't necessarily have the interests of the people who we're interested in mind, can still have an enormous potential for the kind of work that we want to do. That is to say, getting into the experience and the lives and figuring out what motivated people who, by many measures, had almost no chances of living a full life as we might define it. Yet people found a way not just to live that full life, but to make the best of it. And that kind of information can be found in those archives if we're patient enough, if we're creative enough, if we look at them over and over again from different angles. We can find the kind of things that we're looking for, and find things that we didn't even know that we were looking for until we stumble upon them. So I'm all for archives.
Can I just chime in and add
Yeah,
one more
please.
thing?
Yeah.
Because I completely agree, Joe. I think one thing that was coming to mind as you was outlining that was essentially what I've been told by, I think, both of my undergrad and my PhD advisors of following the sources, like allowing, there's so many out there, there's such a wealth of sources to draw from, and if we enter the archive with a rigidity, with a expectation of what we're supposed to find, the story that we want to tell, we end up actually stifling the voices that we could find. We end up stifling the creativity that we should be approaching the archive with, and kind of allowing the sources to speak for themselves, and then they get to dictate the story that we tell. And so, yeah, I just think there's a challenge here, not only to trust that the sources are there, but also to enter the archive with a mentality that is expansive, that is flexible, rather than this is what I'm looking for and this is the type of source it ought to be. How do we kind of move out of that? I have collected so many sources where I'm like, there's just something interesting here. I don't necessarily know what I'm going to do with it, but I can't leave it. And some things will end up in this manuscript. Some things might end up in my third manuscript, but just having an eye and having a willingness to enter with, just a creative mindset with some flexibility. I think there's a lot more that we can do with the existing archive.
I really like that response. Go ahead.
Miller, can I just add another piece to that? Apropos of the specific study of African American history, we on this Freedmen and Southern Society project benefited from having the tutelage of an archivist at the National Archives, Dr. Sarah Dunlap Jackson, whose name I hope you're all familiar with. And if not, please try to familiarize yourself with her. Because here was a woman who had worked in the National Archives from the era of World War II. She was hired technically as, what was the terminology? More or less a custodian. She was a graduate of South Carolina State University. But the archival ranks were not open to persons of her background at that time. And it was only through persistence over many, many years that she was eventually classified as an archivist. But in the meantime, she made it her business of looking at every Civil War record group that could potentially have material pertaining to the African American experience. And even though we knew about her, because in fact, some of the revisionists who were writing new histories of Reconstruction during the 1960s had encountered Sarah, and she had proved so helpful to them that they often acknowledged it in their book acknowledgments. But we could not possibly have understood or appreciated the depth and the range of knowledge that she not only had, but that she willingly shared with us. And I also had the benefit of working with others whom she, in fact, brought up to the trade as well. So Walter Hill, in fact, another graduate of Northern Illinois University, for many years worked as an archivist. And they passed along the legacy. Reginald Washington, for example, took the baton from them. But the kinds of insights that they were able to give to Ira and Leslie and me, especially in the early years of the Freedmen and Southern Society project, are just impossible to recount. And the one other person who benefited from that, who was never formally associated with the project, is Armstead Robinson, who was the founder of the Carter G. Woodson Center in African and Afro-American History at the University of Virginia. So he and Leslie Rowland were doing dissertation research at the same time during the mid-1970s. And they were working largely with military records, and not pension records or service records, but the records of the military command. And they were just finding all kinds of information about emancipation specifically, but about the African American experience more generally. And many of the leads that they were following were ones that had been given to her by Sarah Jackson, to them by Sarah Jackson. So there's a continuity here. And Bina, I think you expressed it very nicely, but I just wanted to fill in one other gap there, kind of not quite the prehistory of all of this, but
Yeah.
in the early years of revisionism as it applied to slavery, the Civil War emancipation experience, and then Reconstruction.
No, that's great. Those are the kind of connections we want being created. Jerry Gerchenhorn just shared in the chat, I believe it's a blog post on Sarah Jackson for anyone who has the chance to look at that. I think this is a good segue to thinking about, y'all are talking about challenges of the archives and rethinking archival materials, but what challenges do you see the field facing? Be it African-American history, be it Southern history, and are there any solutions that you would propose? Would you brave for us if if you feel so willing? Yeah. Joe, would you like to go first on this one?
Sure, I'll be happy to. Well, as I started off, excuse me, referencing the world in which I lived in the 1960s as having so much of a formative influence on my scholarship. Bina, you were kind enough to suggest that my reading of the new generation of historians being influenced by the world around them is not incorrect. So I take that as a positive sign in support of what I'm about to say. I can't help thinking that we're going to find it inescapable to address some of frankly, the lunacy that's going on in today's world. Now, this is not to act naive here. There was plenty of lunacy going around in the 1950s and the 60s. And, you know, I could see it around me, but there was also a kind of momentum on the part of persons who were deeply patriotic. So, you know, all of the other things checked all those boxes, but had a critical perspective on the trajectory of U.S. history and wanted it to change in the direction that it seemed to be changing in during the 1960s. So this had to do with awareness about racial oppression in the United States. People were talking about imperialism, obviously internationally, in terms of the U.S. involvement in imperial ventures from the 19th century into the 20th century. Many of our contemporaries didn't want to hear any of that, but there was a sort of energy surrounding that kind of scholarship within not just our profession, but in all of the social sciences and humanities. And so there was a sense of being part of something that was helping to change the world. And indeed, slowly but surely, some of those changes became institutionalized. And so, you know, there was a sense of satisfaction around that. But as I look around the world today, much of that is being undone, especially here in this country. And there are specific people who are doing it. And they're doing it for reason. They're doing it from a very well-funded and very thoughtful and thoughtfully planned out agenda, if I can be bold enough to say that. But essentially, they want to undo all of the progressive things that seem to have been institutionalized over the past century, quite honestly, maybe even longer than that. And they're doing it very successfully. It might be piecemeal, one brick at a time, but they're pulling all of this stuff apart. And so I can't help thinking that the challenge for today's scholars of every discipline that have to do with the humanities and the social sciences is how do we stop that? What kind of roadblocks can we put in the path of that? And here it's going to involve activism as well as scholarship. So there's no getting around that. And that's both for good and for not so good. Obviously, the kind of intellectual work that much of our scholarship demands obviously has to take time to produce it. So individuals cannot necessarily do everything. But all I'm suggesting here is that the challenge of keeping the challenges of today before us intellectually has to affect the scholarship. And I can't help thinking, and I certainly pray, that the kind of imagination that our young colleagues bring to the study of history is going to both reflect that sensibility, but also help contribute to putting a stop to all of this lunacy and putting a stop to all this right-wing attempt to roll back the hands of time and to reassert either white supremacy or white nationalism or whatever it is that motivates, or Christian nationalism for that matter, that we can do something to put a stop to it. Because I don't think there's there's no common ground that we can find. They're not granting us any common ground right now. So we have to approach it from that standpoint as well.
Thank you, Joe. That's sage advice. Abina? Yeah.
I want to start by saying I completely agree. I think that a lot of the time, I think we can get nervous about entering the fray out of fear of presentism, out of fear of, establishing connections that aren't necessarily there. I feel like we just get very worried when students come to us drawing these connections. And I feel like we have often had an impulse to correct that and just, well, it's not the same because, and it's different because, but to Joe's point, I think that instead of being afraid of that, I think we need to welcome students into the fold who have these who are driven by the moment. I think we need to not be afraid of that or just see it as activism that has nothing to do with the scholarship, but actually something that can change and add new life to the next wave of the scholarship. So I completely agree. And my second thought is, it might seem tangential, but to me, it's not. I think now, especially because bearing all of this in mind, one of the things that I see as I'm not sure whether I'd call it a challenge or a bit of a flaw in how we conceptualize things right now, is there seems to be somewhat of a divide between scholars of the Civil War era and scholars of African American history. And I say that in a very particular way, in that we have tons of phenomenal African American history that is done right up until the cusp of the Civil War era. Then it kind of drops off in the Civil War years, and then we pick back up in Reconstruction. And what I'm doing right now is differentiating between Civil War historians who do cover emancipation and race, Joe and I being two of those. But there are those of us who do that work indeed. But I feel like there's a bit of a conceptual divide between Civil War historians and African-American scholars of African-American history. I feel like there are walls there that I think, especially given this climate, especially given this moment where we are returning to these old ideas of the Civil War not really having anything to do with slavery or with Black people in America, trying this effort to sever African-American history from mainstream narrative of American history. I think that that's something that we really need to address and kind of see a more porous, community between the two. I think, and I say this from experience, people are surprised when I introduce myself as a Civil War historian. And that comes from a few different things, but really important for us to start thinking about what does it mean for us to bridge that gap, bridge that divide, and have more of these, particularly the rich cultural history that exists in the scholarship on African-American history. What does it look like for us to carry that into the Civil War years themselves, and add that kind of cultural, social history depth there from those same historians? And so I see that, at least to me, as significant, even as we have this political kind of issue that we're dealing with right now. I see this as part of the solution, of actually having more and more scholarship that is in the Civil War years that really does show, hey, there is no divide. You cannot sever these two histories from one another. They are one. And that's something that I've gotten to think about even more being here at the Richard Center, even just a month in. One of the things that Dr. Sheldon is doing really, really well is expanding our concept of Civil War history, the Civil War era, and the types of scholars that get to come and be part of the conversation. A scholar that might not necessarily traditionally be considered as Civil War historians. And so I think that that is something else that is a bit of a barrier right now that I'm hoping can be changed and adjusted in the future.
No, thank you for sharing that solution that it sounds like field needs to focus on. Those were challenges. Are there anything you're excited about? Either one of you. We'll start off with Abina. Be they collaborations, be they new directions in the fields that y'all are excited about.
Yeah, I think there's so much that I'm excited about. I think if I can just name a couple of pieces of work that I think are kind of changing the game. I think Alexis Wells Agogome's book, The Souls of Womenfolk, to me is a game changer in terms of the field. One thing that I think I'm hopeful for in terms of these new directions, I kind of talk a little bit about it in my manuscript, is I think we are beginning to move beyond questions of agency. I feel like questions of agency really dominated the conversation for a really long time. And I would argue that they're very limiting. Questions of agency focus on what can and cannot be done and doesn't actually allow for three-dimensionality in African American history, three-dimensionality in the enslaved in particular, and kind of a comfortability with them being complex individuals who make strange choices sometimes that we might not understand and be able to just take at face value. And so Alexis Wells's book really, really does this. I feel like she moves beyond what could and could be done as enslaved women and really moves into what they wanted, what they hoped for, the ways in which we can read their action to understand belief and ideas. And to me, that's kind of the future, is moving past the world that enslaved people were forced to navigate and the world that African Americans were forced to navigate, and actually getting into the world that they created for themselves, the world on their own terms. I think that's one direction that I'm really, really excited about. And again, I mentioned her earlier, but Abby Cooper, who's at Brandeis, she's doing some really interesting work as well on essentially spiritual creativity as a way of understanding, again, how enslaved people understood themselves, how newly freed people understood themselves as well, and understood the project of freedom and their relationship to the state while being stateless, particularly during the Civil War years. So I kind of I feel like we're on the cusp of you referenced it, Joe, of this moment during and after the Civil Rights Movement, of this influx of interest that happened then. I feel like we're kind of on a new wave of that right now, that there's going to be more and more work that is really interested in Black interiority and isn't scared of trying to do that work. I see a lot more interdisciplinary work coming down the pipeline as well. And I think that that's really important. And one last thought, kind of in this, I suppose it's a new direction, but also a challenge that I think we have to be willing to overcome as we kind of move towards this complexity of African American people and away from this binary of agency. I think something that we have to be really cognizant of is not allowing traditional historiographies to haunt us so much that we're not willing to explore the complexity of African American identity and experiences. There are times that I feel that we're so worried about some of those traditional awful and problematic historiographies that we are not willing to allow the enslaved in particular, but African Americans on the whole, to be complicated and not allow ourselves to look at those pieces critically rather than kind of just throwing them out. Like, what can we do here to actually complexify our understandings, and also how do we kind of unpack them in a way that allows us to reach a new, I don't know the word, like a new vanguard, essentially, of understanding. I think sometimes I've experienced it sometimes when I talk about, in particular, looking at people who remained on plantations during the Civil War era. I think the traditional kind of comfortable notion is simply that they, because they couldn't. And to suggest anything else implies that slavery was good. Absolutely not. They had networks of kinship. They had reasons. They had there. I found lots of sources of women who were pregnant and wanted to stay with people who had delivered children. There's a lot more going on here than this binary of you're either resisting it or you like it. And I think in order to get to that complexity of Black experience, we have to not allow these traditional historiographies to limit what we're allowed to ask and limit what we're allowed to hear the sources say to us, if that makes sense.
That definitely does. Joe, would you like to build off that? Yeah.
Well, I agree with what you just said, Abina. In fact, I heartily endorse everything you said, because that's where we need to go. I've got a couple of ideas of things that excite me and that I think can be and perhaps even should be pursued further. The first one of which has to do with material culture. And you can look at this at on several different levels. One of which is the relative absence of engagements of material culture as it affected community formation and well-being of individuals and families and communities under slavery. Now, there are exceptions to this, and I know Whitney's doing some work along those lines. That's very promising, as are others. But a couple of things crossed my mind. So with regard to the material culture, I've been tuned into it for a long time, but for me, it's sort of a breakthrough piece of work with Dylan Penningroth's work on community building surrounding possessions, especially along the South Carolina and Georgia coast. And a lot of work has come out of that, but perhaps not as much as could, because he's really talking about how property mediated relationships, both between enslaved people and their enslavers, but also within families and within communities. So the material culture really involves property, and we need to get property more into a discussion and analysis of African American history, and in fact, American history, and arguably all human history. Because we find when we look, and we don't generally have to look very hard, that the property really is a surrogate for relations between and among human beings. So when you pick up the property and start diving into that, then all kinds of wonderful things open up. So the last piece that I would add to sort of make that point are the recent books by Taya Miles on the bag that the young woman carried that her mother had given her, and Laura Edwards' recent book of Only the Clothes on Their Back. So when you look at something that even looks like inconsequential material culture or inconsequential pieces of property, and Dylan demonstrated this as well, when you start peeling away the fog, I guess you can't do that, peeling away the onion and get down to the substance of it, all kinds of fascinating prospects open up. The second thing I would add, and this gets to your point about breaking down the binary between things that can and can't. In looking at any archive of records, whether it's Freedmen's Bureau records, whether it's military records, whether it's the WPA slave narrative collection, and looking carefully at the testimony of the witnesses, African American witnesses, there is a whole world of what I can only term intellectual history there that we have not fully comprehended and certainly not fully tapped, either in terms of what we do as professional historians or the insights that we can derive from that. And so much of that is so critical to humanity, for that matter. Again, to your point of being about not just resisting or being happy, but what is that middle ground? But what do people think about that middle ground? All of that is there. And I can't help thinking there's going to be an explosion of intellectual history of underclasses that can be derived precisely from archives that were assembled for no reason pertaining to recording the intellectual history of underclasses. So that I see as a very promising future direction as well.
I have to just chime in to completely agree with that. Yeah, I agree, and that's kind of how I'm beginning to see my work more and more. Is actually I'm interested in uncovering intellectual history where we previously haven't seen one. How do we move past conceptualizing intellectual history as just what gets to be published and what gets to, make it into the public sphere as an idea? How do we actually read behaviors and these kind of more mundane, everyday exchanges, everyday items? I loved what you said about material cultures as well, because I think that plays into this too. How do we read these things for an intellectual history of African Americans, particularly enslaved women, in my particular research? But yes, I see a lot more of that happening, and I think it's the future of the field, personally.
I couldn't agree more. For the sake of time, we are 54 minutes in, so no, I really appreciate y'all giving your insights. I wanted to open it up to the audience for some Q&A. If you feel comfortable, anyone in the audience asking a question or typing it out in the chat, feel free to go ahead. If we're thinking of one, I really like the way that y'all talked about these connections between thinking about intellectual histories and how Joe phrased it, this middle ground of experience, that nuance is messy, but the lived experience of people forming community, forming identity. And for my own work in Native American history, I think what's innovative in the field is from people who've read African American history, Black Atlantic history, African diaspora, and are asking these questions about, what do we do with silences in the archives? Okay, there might be, but they're not empty spaces. That how do we ask these questions? And I think that where innovative stuff comes out of these fields is when we're reading each other and we're saying, hey, this is not the same, but similar in certain senses as to what Native American and Indigenous people are experiencing and how we deal with this colonial archive that way. And so I just wanted to add that I found it intriguing the way that both of you answered that in similar ways. Hopefully it means we're doing something correct. We'll see. If we do have any questions, now would be the time.
I have one, Miller.
Yeah, go for it.
If you have looked at the conference program, I would love to hear one panel you're both particularly excited about and why.
I should have had that pulled up. Let me grab it one sec.
The correct answer is all of them, right?
Right.
Yeah.
I won't miss a one.
While Bean is pulling up the program, I have a question that's somewhat self-interested, and that is about how we as scholars present ourselves, both when speaking to other academics, but also more importantly to the public, given the hostility that certain aspects of our political world have towards African American history, towards the history of slavery, towards the history of racism and white supremacy. What can we, both as individual scholars and as a field, do to be both conscientious academics and citizens in this environment without getting fired?
That's a really great question, and one that I am wrestling with too. I think honestly for this one, I can only speak. I can speak as a Black woman who has been in the classroom as a student, and what I needed, and I think what I would need in this context as well. And I think for me, it would be, firstly, I think, an acknowledgement of what's happening. I think a lot of the time I've been in a lot of classrooms where there's a leave it at the door kind of attitude of like, what's happening out there is not happening in here, just leave it. And I think having the boldness to be willing to allow it to bleed into the room, to allow it to be messy inside of the room, I think especially. And then on top of that, of course, that's like specifically in a classroom dynamic. But I think a lot of the time students come with interest in history, as both Joe and I have said, based on interest in what's happening right now. And I think the main thing that we can do is embrace that, and allow them to make those connections. We can correct them along the way when necessary, but not really being quick to shut it down. And then I think in terms of the scholarship side of things, again, I think just when these new works come around, which they will, and it's a bit of a controversial topic, but the 1619 project, for example, stirred up a lot, and it stirred up a lot of frustration with traditional historians who were used to doing things a certain way, were used to constructing arguments in a particular type of way. And I think a lot of backlash ended up actually coming from us to the 1619 project. And it has its, it has its strengths, it has its weaknesses, as every monograph does. But I think we have a responsibility there to not gatekeep. The type of work that people are interested in doing can come from Black studies, it can come from history, it can come from literature. Kind of to Miller's point earlier, like reading each other is important. And I think from the scholarship side of things, I think we need to be more comfortable with sharing the load of this work and interacting with one another across disciplinary lines. I hope that makes sense.
If I could add to that, I have to admit that I'm really torn in terms of the struggles that our colleagues are going through, whose jobs may be on the line for conducting the business of classroom instruction the way we have in the past. And I don't have to call out particular states by name, because after all, for many of our colleagues who are teaching, say, high school or middle school in virtually all the states, they find themselves walking on eggshells right now in terms of what they can or cannot teach, what they can or cannot not even teach, but permit to be introduced as a discussion point in the work that they're doing in the classroom. And that's got to be horrifying. And I have to admit, I don't have any quick answers to that. But I will say this, the program committee did puzzle over this to some extent. And by working carefully with some partners on the outside, largely with Stephen Berry taking the lead, on Saturday at the Charlotte Convention, there are going to be coordinated sessions that are going to try to sort of close in on this topic from a number of different angles. So the centerpiece is going to be a presentation by a number of high school, and there may be a middle school teacher in there as well, but from the Charlotte school system. And they will be talking about the kinds of challenges they are facing and what they're doing to try to keep teaching students and to make sure students keep learning in this atmosphere that we're trying to navigate now. And then we've bookended both morning and afternoon sessions around that are going to pick up the theme, excuse me, of pedagogy in challenging times. And in fact, some of the studies or some of the presentations are going to be focusing on historical case studies. So it's not even the current day. So here's the way where some of the scholarship and some of the pedagogy and some of the activism can come together. But that might partly answer your question too, in terms of which sessions I think are most exciting. That whole Saturday program that's going to be focusing on teaching, I think is going to be enormously consequential. And it's one that perhaps is one that we're going to have to develop more carefully as we go forward in future annual meetings, in part because so much of this is pressing upon the work that we do.
I really appreciate that, Joe. We need to be having those conversations between college faculty, high school, middle school faculty, and really thinking about how we can solve them. I think that has to be time for our interview, our Across the Generations interview. I really appreciate y'all participating. If anyone has any lingering questions, feel free to send them to me, send them to Whitney. We can forward them on. We want to make this a regular thing and something that we can build on before conferences. I know Joe and Abina will be at the SHA. I'll be there as well, along with Whitney. We hope to see as many of you as you can, either at these panels or just come say hi to us. But thanks, everyone. We appreciate it.
Yes, thank you all very much.
Yeah, thank you for
Miller.
coming.
Thank
This was
you,
wonderful.
Thank you, Abina.